Welcome to Open Classroom. Thank you so much for being here. We are so grateful that you've given us this time today. My name is Laurie McConnell. I'm Communications Coordinator here at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. And before we start the Open Classroom webinar, I just want to very quickly do a little quick housekeeping. One thing to note is that this is a webinar format, which means that we can't see or hear you, unfortunately, but we would love to know what's on your mind. So at any time, if you have any questions, any comments, any thoughts you want to share, please feel free to put them in the chat. Just click the chat button on the bottom center of your Zoom screen and let us know how you're feeling. And at the end of the program, we will ask some of your questions of our fantastic presenters and get their takes on anything that's on your mind. Also, to let you know that we're streaming live right now on YouTube. So if you have a friend or colleague who wasn't able to get into the Zoom room today, but still would like to watch it, in just a second, I will put the link to the Brown School YouTube channel in the chat so that you can share that link with friends. And after the program is over, give us a couple of days just for YouTube to process the video. We will have it posted so you can go back and watch any parts that you might have missed or share it with friends or colleagues who weren't able to join us today. I also want to let you know about a few future open classrooms that are coming up. Some great stuff. On Wednesday, October 5th, we're going to discuss the Indian Child Welfare Act as that faces scrutiny in the Supreme Court this fall. On Thursday, October 6th, that's the next webinar in this fantastic series. That one is titled Research Findings, Training Issues, and Capacity Expansion for Family and Youth Peer Support and Advocacy. On Tuesday, October 11th, we have another in our iChat speaker series, which is Digital Innovations for Improving the Lives of People Living with Mental Illness Globally. And on Thursday, October 13th, we return to this series focusing on collaborating with family peer advocates in child mental health research. So I will put a link in the chat to our Open Classroom website. You can get registered for any of these that are of interest to you. They're all fantastic. They're all free, and they're all better when you join us. So I hope you can get registered for some more. But now, what you've been waiting for, today's program, I am so thrilled once again to have our co-facilitator. That would be Cynthia Williams, who is Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships at the Brown School. Thank you, Dean Williams, for being here. We are always so grateful to see you and to get your thoughts. We also have Nicholas Asher, who is Program and Project Assistant at Washington University, and will be graduating in December with not one, not two, but 3 master's degrees. So congratulations to you on that, and has 5 part-time jobs. How do you do that? And of course, I don't need to introduce Dr. Mary McKay, but I will anyway. Dr. McKay is president of the AASWSW, as well as vice provost of Interdisciplinary Initiatives here at Washington University. Dr. McKay has been developing this series, and so I'm going to have her join us today as co-presenter, also to introduce her teammate here today. And I will let you two start the program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lori. Cynthia, Nicholas, as always, thank you for joining us. So hello, everyone. We have 3 different segments of our audience today. I'm here to welcome those of you that were able to join us via Zoom. I'm also going to say hello as we are streaming via YouTube to those that are watching us over the web. And finally, we actually not only post this series to the Open Classrooms websites and some other sites as well, but we also, if you registered or your colleagues registered, we send you out the full program. So we're super excited that you have joined us for this series today. And we're going to really focus on collaborative methods to really improve the lives of children and families. So before we launch in, and I introduce my co-presenter, I just want to do a couple of words of welcome from some different hats that I wear. First is the president of the American Association for Social Work and Social Welfare. We are an organization of serious academics, policymakers, practitioners that really want to rapidly translate science into best practice. And so that's why we are thrilled to be able to have this opportunity to collaborate with 3 important foundations, the W.T. Grant Foundation, Annie Casey, and Casey Family Foundation. Those three foundations have come together to put something together called the 21st Century Research Agenda, really focused on supporting children and families in new ways. And so one of the things that this 21st Research Agenda does is identifies gaps in areas where we need new knowledge to really improve the lives of kids and families. But what's also really important about this 21st Century Agenda is it makes some strong recommendations that we do research in different ways. And that means highly collaborative to involve young people, their families, people from the systems that are serving children, policymakers, providers, those collaborative approaches with the assumption that coming together, we will gain new perspective, we'll ask different types of questions, we'll use different methods. And that's really what my co-presenter, Brittany, and I are going to talk about today. So Nicholas put already in the chat a link to the executive summary of the 21st Century Research Agenda, and you can find actually the whole report if you follow the information in that executive summary. So now let me introduce my co-presenter, and you can see her bio, from some of the materials that Lori's passed out to you. But I want to introduce you, Brittany, in a way that it's a little bit more personal, if that's okay. Brittany is a brand new PhD. An incredible researcher that has published a set of papers that really do relate to child well-being, is incredibly interested in how do you support families and communities for kids to be okay. She also has a lived journey that informs her perspective about how it is so mission critical to conduct research in partnership and collaboration. And so I've gotten to know you, Brittany, along the journey from doctoral student to now new PhD to an important program capacity, role within the foundation world. And so I'm super excited to present with you. So I'm going to take the role of kind of an academic that does a lot of collaborative research. And I'm going to talk about those methods. And then Brittany's going to come on and really kind of, I think, emphasize why these collaborative methods really matter for kids and families. Is that fair, Brittany? Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and share with you some of the content that I brought with me. Sorry about that, but I'm going to get to the beginning. Okay. So Brittany, am I okay? You can see my screen? Okay, great. So I'm going to focus on research methods and the opportunities to infuse the voice, the preferences, choices for young people, adult caregivers, providers, within a program of research that I've had the privilege of contributing to in collaborative teams for decades. And so I think in the spirit of this series, I just want to spend a couple of my first slides really honoring my collaborative mentors. And what's really important about the program of research that I'm going to talk with you about today, and particularly the rigorous research methods we use, is that there is a set of folks that are academics like myself that have really taught me a lot about collaborative research methods or participatory methods that sometimes they're called. There's also a set of policymakers at New York State, family advocates embedded within state systems, within child serving systems. And then there's also a set of young people, families, providers, both in our US-based studies as well as across the globe, because about half of my program of research focuses on kids and families in the US, and the other half in kind of across global contexts. Most importantly, I want to introduce you to this concept of a community collaborative board. These are young people, the adults who are raising them, providers within child serving systems, officials that are funding those systems, leaders in the research community coming together And in fact, not just advising the research, but overseeing an entire program of research, from co-creating the research questions that we're going to ask together, to co-creating opportunities to seek funding, to actually working out all the details in a study, from the design, to the sampling approach, to implementation of any type of intervention, to looking at the data and disseminating findings. And this is a kind of a robust collaboration that we have brought for years to really oversee and support and organize our studies. And so we've written a lot about how you put these collaborations together. But what I can tell you is, across the US, across our global experience, this type of collaboration makes studies richer, more relevant, really potentially yields things that are acceptable and very helpful to kids and families that I couldn't come up with by myself. So I really want to give a nod to my collaborators in this picture and beyond that served on our community collaborative boards. I also want to introduce the notion of, in addition to an oversight board that really does look at the whole of a project, within that board, there are many, many working groups that dig deep into what does the existing research say and where are the gaps in some of the ways that the knowledge that we need to serve children and families. So this is an example of a working group that really came together to try to understand what are, for example, some of the unmet mental health needs of young people. What would be, from an evidence-based perspective, what would be good approaches, and how did they map that on to what they thought themselves as adult caregivers, what their neighbors would need to help children be well. And so it's both kind of at the board level, how do you oversee a study, but at a much more working group level. These are all paid contributors to our study. And I think that's also incredibly important. So these are not volunteer roles. They're critically important contributors to the program of research that I'm going to talk with you about. Also, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of advocacy coalitions, people with lived experience that really are trying to shift both how research is done, but how it's used, how systems are defined. And so I just want to say thank you to my US-based colleagues, as well as our global funders and our global set of colleagues who really do important collaborative work with us. I also want to acknowledge that when you're really trying to help and deliver programs and services and transform systems that serve children and families, it often takes a team approach, a collaborative interdisciplinary research team that's evaluating those programs and services, and certainly a team of planners and implementers and collaborators. And I think that what somebody like me, that is usually the person talking, you could assume that this is my work, and you're getting the idea that this is very much shared work across a large number of people, both in the US and across the globe, that really came together to try to improve the lives of kids and families. So why would we spend time engaging so many colleagues in our research activities? Because inherently in our research enterprise, there's a set of known challenges around how you go from knowledge created through research into actual any type of change for kids and their families, whether that be practice change, whether that be policy change. There is a ginormous gap between the evidence base that we build as academics and whether any of that influences what happens to kids or family members, or influences what services are provided or not, or what is paid for. And so it is really our attempt to bridge that not small gap between research and actually what's offered and supports kids and their families. It's our attempt that we think that collaboration, and really beginning with system owners and families themselves who care about the outcomes of the study, if we begin in a collaborative way, it could shorten the time between whether we find something that's helpful in our research, and that could actually impact the lives of kids and families. So, there's a set of things that I learned in my doctoral program, Brittany, that I hope you did not learn, being of a different generation. And one of the things that I learned is that you don't share your hypothesis necessarily, and that's not true in our program of research. We are very explicit about the assumptions that we make around the contribution of collaboration with people with lived experience. We believe, and we test this over and over again in our program of research, that when we collaborate with young people and parents and providers and community members, we come up with studies and interventions that are potentially more acceptable, more relevant to context and specific needs and preferences, potentially more effective, and actually can be sustained in the settings that they were designed for. And so as we make these assumptions explicit, then we go about really systematically deploying collaborative methods to actually drive a research agenda that we think will make a bigger difference in the quickest amount of time. So how do we put together collaboration? We've written a lot about this. I can actually do quite a talk that would take me the whole time, but I want to really get Brittany's voice in here very quickly. But I want to at least put out some principles that are incredibly important if you're putting together a community collaborative board, if you're trying to work in a collaborative way with a working group. And that is that we really do focus on, are we here for the same reasons? How do we get a shared set of goals that guide the work? How are we centering, sharing, decision-making, and power? How are we making sure that we are recognizing the value and the skills and the expertise of all involved in the collaboration? And I think that's really an important kind of assumption underneath collaborative research, is that it's more typical to center kind of those research skills. And yet the lived experience, the expertise that young people and families and communities bring, that also needs to be equally centered as we kind of come in to a different collaborative space and create new programs and services and supports and opportunities. Ongoing opportunities for communication, development of trust, incredibly important. As you think about those dimensions, you can think about them from the far left, which is kind of research-driven goals exclusively, all the way to really highly integrated collaborative choices that you make around how you set up projects, how you set up steering committees. And Brittany, I'll be honest, I think the 21st Century Research Agenda Steering Committee really models the right side of this chart, where there's lots of opportunities to center skills and expertise and really bring diverse voices into that research agenda that we're trying to transform in terms of kids and families' lives. So I can't dive deep into all the research methods, except to give you, call your attention, if you are conducting studies, that you have a lot of tools available and a lot of opportunities to kind of integrate voice and choice and preferences of people that you're trying to ultimately help. And you can do that in kind of a way around organizing focus groups and taking seriously, integrating existing evidence with the voice and choices and preferences of those that you're trying to collaborate with. Certainly, a community advisory, community collaborative board, making sure that your staff represent diverse voices, diverse lived experience, and then certainly thinking about collaboration at every point of a research study. And I don't need you to read all the words except to kind of take away the point from this particular slide, which is at every part of a study that we design, we are making choices around how collaborative we are going to be, how many people we are going to take their feedback into consideration as we put together study questions or aims, whether we consider different research designs or sampling approaches. There is a set of standardized measures that my community collaborative board really thinks speak to their lived experience. And then there's a set of standardized measures that they find confusing and not really tapping into the words or the experiences that we're trying to measure. And so at every stage of a study, including the dissemination of findings, there's opportunities to collaborate with young people, with family members, our community colleagues, and those choices I want to make explicit as we go forward in this presentation. So the last piece that I just want to talk about before I dive into a few other pieces of information that I want to pass on is that I'm referring to collaborative research methods. These are sometimes known as participatory action research methods. And the distinction that I make here is that there is direct benefit for people with lived experience, young people, families. There's direct benefit from actually participating. One of the direct benefits, Brittany, if I may say, of you contributing to our steering committee is you got a great job, postdoc. And so that I think is important to really think about employment opportunities, to think about paid positions, and to really think about, in addition to potentially influencing, how science is done or publications, that there's also direct benefit from participation in these particular studies. Any project that really is in this kind of participatory action framework builds on strengths, involves members across each phase of a project. There's a lot of opportunities for feedback and course correction. And so these are some of the dimensions that we often consider as we're putting together a collaborative project or study or steering committee. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of this as we go forward. So the other kind of thing I want to alert you kind of to and talk about just a minute is that as we think about collaborative research methods, we think about, the opportunity to infuse voice and choice into our studies, but we also think about collaboration as existing within the teams that we put together. So if you could kind of apply even, Brittany, what we've done with our steering committee, there's actually a science about how you put together teams. And that science really rests on how you put together diverse members with diverse perspectives that are committed to similar outcomes. And that the attention that you pay to really building on the relationships and the interpersonal skills of team members, the emotional engagement, as well as the work engagement, is incredibly important to foster collaboration at all levels of your project or study. I'll be glad to share these slides so you don't have to look at every box. But what really this kind of set of this figure actually suggests is that as you're putting together members of collaborative steering committees, collaborative boards, interdisciplinary research teams, you are paying attention to diverse perspectives, characteristics. You're really working not only on work plans, but you're also working on building bonds and relationships and building the kind of container, if you will, for open, honest exchange of ideas, where it's safe for people to speak, there's support, and disagreements are handled in ways that are productive and that lets teams move forward. So incredibly important, not only to apply these kind of collaborative skills and collaborative science to larger community collaborative boards, but to every aspect of your research study as you go forward. There's a lot of ways we do this, from teamwork exercises to, in some ways, just doing what we did before this webinar, which is to share stories and to kind of engage each other as human beings, in addition to kind of, co-presenters. And we really do try to kind of think about how are we constantly trying to help people to share goals and to reinforce working together. And I just show this picture. These are my colleagues all over the globe. Why do they include their children? Because people's whole selves matter in your research teams, in your collaborative boards. And so how do you create space for people to bring themselves in their whole of their lived experience. What's also important about this webinar series, Cynthia Williams, our Assistant Dean for Community Partnership, she's been the moderator of several of these sessions. What I learned about her last week that I had no idea, even though I've worked together with Cynthia for 6.5 years, is she was also a foster parent for many, many kids. That didn't come up in our 6 years of work together. It only came up through this series. Incredibly important that we create space for people to bring their full-on experience to their work, because it enriches the experience, also enriches the work. So I'm going to end a little bit beyond our assumptions to, is this helpful? Does it yield academic research that your universities will recognize? Does it yield findings that will improve what we have to offer for kids and their families? And as a matter of fact, I'm happy to put on our website after this presentation these papers and others that suggest that when young people and parents and foster parents and providers and system leaders come together, the programs, the services have a different look and feel, have a relevance, and certainly have impact. And we've published a lot on that impact for kids and families. So with that, Brittany, I'm just going to say a couple of other words. What I've really appreciated about being part of the steering committee for the 21st Century Research Agenda, really focused on kids and families, is the way we've been able to work together across institutions, across roles, across experiences and perspectives. And one of the greatest benefits is I got to know you. And that was incredibly important to watch you work as both a scientist and then with somebody that had real sensitivity because of your unique journey for what kids and families needed. And so I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm super excited to hear your talk, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk a little bit with Cynthia Williams. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, that was good setup. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my slides. Oops. Sorry about that. Now I'm gonna share my slides.
There you are.
All right.
I can see you and put it on presentation mode. There you are.
Look okay? Awesome.
Great. Here you go.
All right, so thanks. So I'm going to do, I guess something maybe a little bit different. So Mary did a really good job kind of covering specifics for kind of researchers and all of the science behind doing something like this. So I just thought I would share a little bit about myself as a person with lived experience, and then transitioning into a researcher and kind of learning to wear both of those hats and kind of learning to wear them at the same time. So my background, so I was in foster care in middle and high school in Indiana. So I'm the angsty looking teenager in these photos, and those are other kids that I was in care with. And then I had kind of an informal reunification or kin placement situation in the final months of high school. And so I then went on to college. And as I started kind of thinking about, okay, what do I want to do with my life? I knew it was something related to working with kids and families. Didn't quite fully put together, all the different options for how to marry those two hats that I was interested in wearing. But I think something that I noticed quickly when I started reading the literature about foster youth, how foster youth transition to college, transition to adulthood, is that I think I felt that there was this assumption or this focus on youth that maybe didn't have a connection with their first families or biological families anymore. And that was not my experience. So these are my parents. Things have not always been perfect, but I still am in contact with both of my parents. And even though, reunification didn't go the way that it was supposed to, or we would have maybe hoped it would for most families when I was in foster care, I don't think my parents were bad parents. I think they were doing the best they could with what they had and what they were struggling with at the time. And so that kind of became important to me too, to kind of think about foster youth that were not just kind of in a vacuum, but also their families. So then I went to Purdue. My PhD I just finished is in human development and family studies. So I kind of transitioned from the more individual psychology field into a family focused field because of that. And so I just started a position as a research analyst with Casey Family Programs, where I'll get to, so I'm actually the first they created a position specific, a postdoc position specifically for folks with lived experience. And as you kind of mentioned, Mary, that kind of came out of some of the work we were doing with the National Research Agenda Project. And just to kind of add on to what you had kind of said about co-design and sharing this, it came up in the project that, folks with lived experience were going to lots of meetings. I mean, Kate, they did a really good job, involving us at all stages of the process. They kind of evolved over time. But something that came up is if someone with lived experience was full-time on the staff, they'd be at all these meetings. They would have, the time to really work on these documents and be at all the planning meetings and the coordinating and stuff like that. And they really took that seriously and kind of created a position that hopefully, I can fill those big shoes. So that's exciting. All right, so a little bit, I guess, first about some of my research that's been informed by my own lived experience. So I went to graduate school. My advisor was a statistician, and we didn't share a lot of content area interests at first. And so she set me up to get access to this data set. So some of you are probably familiar with this, the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Wellbeing, or NSCAW. And so I spent a lot of time just kind of going through this data set. So it's a longitudinal data set where families who are involved with the child welfare system, we have data from and about kids, caregivers, caseworkers, teachers in some cases, maybe foster caregivers, things like this. So kind of asking all these different questions about child well-being, family well-being. And so I kind of got this idea for a paper. So I'd seen some research on the negative impact of placement instability for foster youth. So the moving between homes and how that impacted educational trajectories. And I was kind of thinking to myself, what if it's not just about the move, but it's also about how kids are feeling about like the potential for a move. So, I mean, I was older when I was in foster care. I was a teenager. I was old enough to understand that, I saw other foster youth come and go. I knew that there were court dates coming up or that would maybe determine that I would go live somewhere else. A foster parent sometimes, would decide not to renew their license or to end a placement. So, I mean, they're just kind of, you'd walk home from school and your caseworker's car's in the driveway and you're like, oh crap, who's moving? Is it me? And so it's not even just the move. I felt like, man, it's really how do I feel? And how does that impact, all kinds of things. And so I wrote a proposal and got this project funded through the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program. And so I kind of looked at this idea of what I was calling placement security. So of course there wasn't a placement security module in the NSCAW data set, but I kind of looked at, older foster youth were asked questions about their relationships with their caregivers, foster caregivers, kind of their feelings about being in out-of-home placement. And I kind of pieced together some items that I thought kind of tapped into what I remember my experience of like just being worried about placement stability. And it wasn't perfect, secondary data, you're kind of dealing with, you're dealing with, kind of creating measures, or maybe they don't tap into exactly what you want, or the wording isn't what you want, but I think it did an okay job kind of getting at the initial concept. So kind of did, and then because my advisor was a statistician, I made sure, I learned how to do all of the things that are required in high quality studies. So kind of making sure this, a confirmatory factor analysis, make sure this kind of hung together as a coherent measure of what I was trying to get at. And then I kind of looked at it in this structural equation modeling approach, where I was kind of looking at, just this placement security and or what I was calling caregiver educational involvement. So this is like my foster parents, like, hey, go do your homework. Hey, what did you do in school today? Kind of those things affect school engagement, teenagers' self-reported school engagement. So how they think they're doing in school, they like to be in school. And is that mediated by kids' future expectations of just positive life outcomes? And I found in this work that sense of placement security or insecurity matters more, a lot more than a caregiver telling you, hey, do your homework, for whether or not you're actually getting that homework done. So that was kind of one example that was published a couple of years ago. And again, share these slides and everything. If folks have questions about this paper, I'm happy to talk more about it. And then a more recent example. So again, I had kind of talked earlier about I still had relationships with my first family, or my biological family, while I also had relationships with some long-term foster caregivers that I had. And so this kind of paper came from that tension that I remember experiencing, where it's like my biological parents and my foster parents kind of felt like they were adversaries. I kind of felt in the middle of that. My parents were also, divorced. So I kind of felt like there was this triangle of, who do I show allegiance to? This appears in the literature as usually like a loyalty conflict. And so again, I used the same data set that I was gaining familiarity with as a grad student to kind of see, okay, can we tap into this idea of I was calling it juggling families, but just this idea of feeling kind of a tension between families or is there a trade-off between high quality relationships with foster caregivers as opposed to biological or first families? And does that kind of explain depression or internalizing behaviors, anxiety in youth? And it does, and also different for youth that are in kinship care versus not. So I can talk more about that if folks are interested later. So that was research kind of informed by my own lived experience. And then for my dissertation, I kind of branched out into research kind of informed by others' lived experience. So I kind of like putting on that other hat. So for my dissertation, I was really interested in parents' experiences and well-being kind of during and after these non-voluntary child welfare interventions. I mean, I remember my parents being so frustrated. And one of my parents kind of deciding mid-intervention, like I'll just resume my relationship with my child when they're an adult because this is too hard, which is as an adult now is really frustrating. And also after, you know, the formal proceedings ended, all the services for my parents also ended. And I mean, I'm almost 30 years old and my parents still, you know, deal with some of the same things that they dealt with when I was in foster care. So, I mean, this kind of issue is just really close to my heart, but also like, I'm not a parent. I'm not a parent that's been through the experience. And so I really kind of had to practice some of these things that Mary was talking about of how do I, engage lived experience from parents. So I kind of have, my dissertation was not properly mixed methods because I'm not mixing these methods in the same studies, but one of my papers was a qualitative paper where I kind of asked parents about their experiences. So that when I'm quantitatively assessing parents' experiences and well-beings, I'm getting at some of the more salient things for parents. So not what I think maybe or, you know, some of the most impactful aspects of child welfare intervention from the perspective of parents, but what these, you know, parents are saying ended up being the most impactful for them. And then I also engaged in some of what Mary talked about earlier with the, you know, having an advisory council, a group of folks. So I was really lucky to have, as part of my work with the 21st Century Research Agenda Project, there are 6 of us, lived experience experts on that project. And so we all become really close. And so I was really lucky to kind of have that more informal group. And many of them are parents, and I would, you know, share drafts with them, share ideas with them. They were really good at keeping me accountable, helping me realize what I was leaving out. One person in particular would, you know, remind me, like, you know, you got to think about these things. They're going to be different for, you know, Black parents in the system versus white parents in the system. If you're in a, you know, I'm in Indiana, like a, you know, a predominantly white area, kind of really think critically about differences for maybe moms versus dads and stereotypes about, you know, gendered stereotypes about parenting, really kind of thinking specifically about the intersection with substance use and what it's like, not only to be going through, you know, the child welfare system as a parent, but to be dealing with, you know, substance use, you know, maybe stigma, but also like just the experience of new sobriety, like physically your body's different, your emotions are different, everything is different, your social circle's different, all these things I wouldn't have known to think about or ask about for my dissertation. Really, I only could have known about by working with folks with lived experience with the questions that I was interested in. So that's kind of an example of that. And then, I mean, some challenges, Mary touched on some of this too, but I think for an early career researcher, I had a really hard time, you know, pitching to my dissertation committee that one of my theoretical or guiding frameworks was this idea of incorporating lived experience into research in a meaningful way. And so I think it was sometimes hard to translate that. And I think there are more resources now, but it was kind of hard a couple of years ago to translate that, you know, as a grad student that hadn't received any training about that in graduate school, into what was considered a high quality or rigorous dissertation proposal for my committee. So I think that is definitely a challenge. Obviously incorporating lived experience can be expensive and time intensive. So that, you know, was kind of, I don't think I was able to engage parents as much as I wanted to, or able to pay them as much as I would wanted to. So that's definitely something I think that people struggle with. And then I think sometimes there's a lack of clarity on multiple levels. Like, how do I even do this? I think lots of folks are like, oh, I want to do this and I want to do it well, but I don't know how to do it. And that, you know, sort of for researchers and funders. And so I'll end with this. So there's a forthcoming research that we're developing with support from William T. Grant, the Casey Family Programs, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So myself, another lived experience expert who's a parent, and then a child welfare researcher are developing this research brief specifically for funders. So we're writing things for funders of research about incorporating lived experience in research. So maybe saying things like, you know, researchers are saying that this is really expensive and time intensive for researchers to be able to do this the way they want to do it, funders have to be, you know, a little flexible or maybe willing to invest in these things a little more. And some researchers have also worried, oh, is this a fad? Is lived experience engagement kind of a fad? If so, how sustainable is this? Can we count on the money being here for a grant renewal? Can we count on being able to build this in, if we were planning a 5 or 10 or 20-year study? So early 2023, hopefully this will be out, and obviously we'll be sharing this widely. All 3 of the foundations there will be disseminating it, and I'm sure we can get Mary to have the Academy distribute it as well. So that'll be something that'll hopefully be useful as well. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much for your time, and happy to answer questions or elaborate on anything. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to both of you for such a wonderful presentation. Mary, if I can, I'd like to start with you with a particular question, and then to you, Brittany, and then Mary, I'll turn it back over to you. Mary, at first, I was really impressed with your opening slide that acknowledged collaborative mentors. I've seen many a research document, and I've seen very few, if any, that open with acknowledgement of mentors versus experts or partners. Right away, I appreciate the humility that you present in your very opening slide and how that was represented throughout your presentation. Will you please tell us and summarize for us how important do you think humility in research and working with community is that a fad? Is that sustainable? Can you summarize that for me, your feelings about that?
Oh, goodness. See, you asked the best questions, Cynthia, and ones that people don't ask. It's a very complicated situation that scientists like myself find themselves in, right? So there's an academy, there's a set of universities that reward certain things, right? And we know what those are. They're grant applications, there's publications, they're potentially even science in more traditional ways that in packages. And so I think that yields that those research products yield particular things, and they fall down in terms of impact and really connecting to the lives of kids and families. And that's why those gaps exist. That's why it takes 17 years from like a research finding to get into clinical care, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we embarked, I like to say, because I am many decades old in this research game, on a different journey, which is to be open to learning about what we didn't know as scientists, and to try to put together a set of studies that could close that gap. And then where does humbleness come in? If I thought that the traditional paradigms actually could improve the lives more quickly for kids and families, I would go that way. But humbly, we have just decades of evidence that that those gaps are persistent, and we make up very little ground using traditional methods. So I think the humbleness comes in with recognizing that you know things, you learn things as a scientist, and they're insufficient to actually have the impact that you need. And so I don't think humbleness is a fad. I think it's actually a fine, like, human characteristic that we all should carry around. Humbleness also allows us to listen better, be open to feedback, take in information that we might ordinarily miss. And that's kind of the foundation in my world for collaboration. But I think, to be fair to the scientists on the call, the academy can be pretty puffed up. You can be rewarded for different things. And so you really have to have, I think, a human commitment, a scientific commitment to conduct your research in different ways. And that's actually the kind of theme throughout the 21st Century Research Agenda document. It's not just conducting research on gaps, but it's how we conduct that research that really matters. And so I appreciate, there's a lot of people that have taught me a lot of things along the way, Cynthia. So I frame it as really important to give them credit. Does that help?
It does. Thank you so much. Brittany, I'll go to you. Last question from me, and that is first a response. As a former foster parent, my heart goes out to the progress, success that you have accomplished coming out of such a complicated system, and a system in which the word languishing has always been attached. Children in foster care languishing. It always hurt my feelings as a foster parent because I know I was doing my best. I would like for you to address, could you summarize for the audience and for myself, what do you think your lived experience, if you would have put it in a couple of sentences, what do you think your lived experience has really contributed to research now and moving forward? How important is that to research? And I'm so impressed that there is there's room for lived experience. That's relatively new to me. But how does that lived experience in your summary really impact the work that you are trying to push forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think maybe I have a multi-part answer if that's okay. So I think first, I care about the work a lot. Like, I've definitely as a grad student or a collaborator worked on projects where maybe I was getting paid to do it. I mean, if you look at my CV, you'll see that some of my publications are in engineering education. That was just like one of my jobs while I was in college and as a master's student. And so it was interesting, but if we didn't figure out a particular piece of nanotechnology education, I was kind of like, oh, well, so for me, it's like, no, the answers to these questions that I have about how do we promote children and families, like it really matters. And I grew up with folks that like are dealing with the real life implications of, well, what if we don't get it right? Like, I mean, there are so many people, like, it's just not okay. Like, I can't just be like, oh, we don't know. And so I think that, I guess another part to my answer is that, I feel like I hear a lot as a researcher, oh, the data are what they are. Like, we can't get at these questions very well. Like the data just kind of are what they are. And I think like, but no, like that's not going to work. Like, but they could be different. Like someone's designing these studies, someone's writing this wording, kind of like Mary was saying, having advisory boards that say, hey, these items don't resonate with me in my experience, or, hey, these are really kind of getting at what I'm feeling, in a way to put it on paper, put it into numbers, in a way that, researchers are maybe looking for. So I think, just the persistence that, no, we can change research and make it more applicable. And then I think also like the lived experience for myself and I think for other colleagues is that to ask research questions that maybe folks wouldn't have known to ask if you're coming at it from a purely empirical scientific. So like the juggling families thing. I feel like a lot of the research is about, relationship with foster parents or relationship with parents, and kind of not like, well, what does it mean if at the same time I'm, kind of dealing with both or I mean, I had foster caregivers that were really jealous of my biological parents, or vice versa, so it was like, that was really hard because I need to fit into this like social ecosystem in this foster home while I'm here 90% of the time, but I don't want to participate in saying anything negative about my family because that's my family. And I want them. So it's just, that's really hard. So I think I've had some folks say like, oh, that's so interesting. And I just think like, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but, but empirically, but like, that's my experience. And I feel like I couldn't be the only one that was, experiencing it. And I would talk to other former foster youth, just kind of, chatting with friends, and they're like, oh yeah, totally. That happened. So it's like, okay, you're kind of drawing from this experience and kind of, I think, pivoting science in a way that hopefully makes it more applicable to real people's lives, which I think if you ask researchers, that's what they want. Like, I think people, want to be doing work that matters. And I think part of the gap that Mary talked about between research and practice is sometimes there is a disconnect, not just in getting the research to folks that are practicing with families, but in making sure that research is even relevant. So hopefully that wasn't too much an answer to your question.
Absolutely. And Mary, Nicholas has a question for you.
Please, Nicholas.
Yeah, Mary, could you share more about your work on like the global like collaborative settings on how like different cultures impacted your work and how you like different cultures, like what you learned from them?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I'm glad somebody asked about global work. The gift of global work, particularly when you're not from the country context that you are working in, is it should be very apparent to you as a scientist and as a human that you know a lot less here. So it's kind of, I describe it as you get off a kind of an airplane, whether that be, a lot of our work is in sub-Saharan Africa. So whether that be in Accra in Ghana, in Kampala in Uganda, in South Africa, you get off the plane and you're more deeply aware that you have a lot to learn about this context, a lot to learn about the cultural context, the preferences. And so that is the perfect place for your community collaborators to be super involved in explaining what matters and what doesn't, and what's valued and what's prohibited and what's preferred, right? I like the question about global because that's pretty apparent, but we also, as scientists, bring, when we're comfortable in our context, we say, oh, I know what the residents of North St. Louis need because I live here. Or I know what that collaborative board was situated in the Bronx. I know because I spent 22 years in New York. I have the stories of those kids and families in me. But in fact, I don't know. I don't have the same experience that Brittany just articulated about what is that journey that a young person is on as they're trying to navigate all the adults in their space. And so culture, understanding culture and how that gets manifested in preferences and in program components is incredibly important. And so we set up boards and working groups to really have people tell us. And then this is the complexity, Nicholas, that happens when you're deeply committed to collaboration, and then when your collaborators tell you something that you don't want to hear. So I'll give you a really good example. I did a lot of work in South Africa around HIV prevention for young people. And those of you that know the HIV world know that sub-Saharan Africa was hit really hard by HIV and AIDS, and prevalence rates very, very high in double digits. And so when we set up our collaborative board really to design programs for young people and the adults that cared for them, our collaborative board members were super clear that it would violate a set of family norms to talk with kids directly about puberty, around sexuality, and around HIV and AIDS. So just take that in for a minute. I'm off a plane, I'm here to help, and my board is saying, yes, HIV is a problem in our community, but you cannot talk about puberty, sex, and HIV. And so as a researcher and as a human being, you launch into like this educational mode. Well, let me just tell you that in order to be effective, you have to, and that won't work. If you're truly committed to collaboration, the next question is, then how would you approach this? Given your preferences, given the cultural norms, what's the answers? And in fact, our collaborators had the answers. And they took the form of these cartoon-based program components where you didn't talk directly about these issues with your child, but you advised this cartoon family called the Kawe family. I know a little Zulu. And because that was acceptable. Being in other people's business was actually quite fun. Advising what other families should do felt very normative, but through that process, your child and you as the adults were taking in information. So culture is tricky because if you're really going to take it into account and how it shows up in people's lives, then you also have to infuse it in acceptable approaches in any program or service. And sometimes you won't know how to do that humbly, but your colleagues do. And so I think that's a great question. What I find almost universally is parents and adults want good things for children. That's kind of a universal value. that they want them to be healthy, well, educated, safe. And I think there are some consistent human principles that you can tap into, but then how all of the processes that help that happen show up are really contextually and culturally based. And that's what you have to infuse in each time. So the program components really, the science doesn't necessarily change about what kids need to be healthy and well and educated, but how those program components show up really does differ depending on culture and context and preference. Does that answer the question?
Yes, even
Awesome.
more so. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Any last thoughts, Brittany, that you want to share?
I was thinking, sometimes I still feel like, in some settings, not this setting, but in some settings, I'm still pitching the value of lived experience engagement to researchers. But like while you were talking about, your intervention that you came up with, I think, involving folks with lived experience, like you're just going to have a more effective like product or intervention. Like it just makes sense, even if you're not going at it from, even if you just say, okay, I'm a researcher, I want to be most efficient. Often like just asking the folks, like if something's wrong with my car, I don't know anything about it. It makes way more sense for me to ask people that know about it. I mean, that's a horrible example, but it's just like, you're asking folks that, yeah, for you, I mean, it would have taken, how long would it have taken you to read books or whatever and be like, oh, okay, this is the culture here, and then you still wouldn't have been able to land on that thing. So I think even, that's just one of the things I always kind of point out, and you hate to make it about, just efficiency or logistics, but I think it just is like from a scientific perspective, like rigorous, like it is, I think it really kind of helps direct, research to being really useful. And often I think you can arrive at some really relevant ideas in a quicker way than if you aren't engaging with lived experience at all. So thank you all. Thank you so much. This was a really great conversation.
Oh my gosh, thank you. You made it
Yes, this is
incredibly rich.
fantastic.
Thank
In the
you.
spirit of collaboration, I just want to really quickly say to our attendees, we want to know what you think. So in the chat is a link to a survey. We would love to hear what you think about the program that you saw today. It's a very quick, very brief survey, but it will help make us better so that we can then hopefully make you a little better too. So I will get back off, but I encourage everyone to try and fill out that survey when you get a chance. Thank you.
Thank you all. Brittany, thank you. Cynthia, Nicholas, you're awesome partners in this work. Lori, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we appreciate all of our audiences. Take care, everybody. Thank you.